It started like any normal Saturday morning. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, the sun just starting to warm the perfectly manicured lawns of the neighborhood when I heard a sharp, insistent knock at my door. Not the casual, hi neighbor knock, the kind that immediately makes your gut tense, like something was about to go very wrong. I opened the door to find two people I didn't know, standing there with clipboards in hand. One of them, a woman in a neatly pressed blazer, had that I know the rules better than you do look on her face. The other, a man with a tight, polite smile, seemed like he had been rehearsing the right tone of voice for weeks. I would later find out that they were two members of the local HOA board, but at the time, all I saw was a combination of authority and irritation aimed directly at me. Before I could even say good morning, they started reading from a list. Your mailbox is off-center, the woman began, pointing at it like it had personally insulted her. Your grass is too green. I blinked. Too green? Was there a secret chart somewhere that measured the exact shade of lawn acceptable in this town? And your shrubs are not trimmed according to community standards. The man chimed in, holding his clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe. I tried to keep a straight face. I've always been good at staying calm in awkward situations, and this felt absurd enough to laugh at. I'm not under your HOA, I said, keeping my voice steady, almost conversational. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I watched as confusion and disbelief flashed across their faces. They had prepared themselves for a polite nod, a quick correction, maybe a promise to comply, but not this. Not a direct, confident refusal. Well, you're technically, the HOA has jurisdiction over all homes in this neighborhood. The woman stammered, flipping through her clipboard as if the rules were going to magically prove her point. I'm not part of this HOA, I repeated, my tone calm but firm. I'm aware of the rules, I just don't answer to them. Their eyes widened slightly. The man swallowed nervously and glanced at his phone. I didn't notice at first, but that was when they were probably dialing the police. I leaned against the doorframe, smiling faintly, amused by the sheer absurdity of it all. These people had clearly practiced their whole confrontation speech in front of a mirror. They had no idea that the rules they thought I lived under didn't apply to me at all. A few minutes later, they muttered something about enforcing the rules and left, walking down my driveway like I was supposed to feel guilty or intimidated. But I didn't. I watched them go, and I could almost hear them whispering, probably wondering how to escalate this little confrontation. It wasn't until much later that I realized the real tension wasn't the mailbox, the shrubs, or even the grass. It was that I had just planted a seed of doubt in their minds, and they hated it. They hated the idea that someone could outright refuse to follow their rules. Little did they know this was only the beginning. By the end of the week, things would escalate in ways they never imagined. I hadn't just told them I wasn't under their HOA, I had set the stage for a full-blown showdown, and I wasn't even worried. In fact, I was starting to enjoy it. As I closed the door and returned to my coffee, I couldn't help but grin. This wasn't going to be a normal weekend. Something told me the next few days were going to be interesting. And I was ready for every second of it. I had barely finished my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. A quick glance told me it was a call I wasn't expecting. The HOA board had decided to escalate things, and apparently the way to do that was by involving the police. Within 10 minutes, 2 officers arrived, walking up my driveway with the kind of cautious professionalism that suggested they were trying to figure out why they had even been called in the first place. One of them, a younger guy with a slightly crooked badge, gave me a polite nod. The other, a more experienced officer with graying hair and a tired look, held his hands behind his back and spoke in a tone that made it clear he had seen too many small-town disputes to take this seriously. I stepped outside to greet them, keeping my expression calm. Good morning, officers, how can I help you? The younger one glanced at the clipboard the HOA had apparently given them. We received a report about possible HOA violations on your property. He sounded unsure of himself, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. I blinked, trying not to laugh. Violations? I asked. I'm not part of this HOA. I'm aware of their rules, but they don't apply to me. The older officer raised an eyebrow. You're saying the HOA has no authority over your property. I nodded calmly. Exactly, I'm the property owner. I'm aware of what's going on, and I've followed all laws, local codes, and ordinances. But the HOA, they don't have jurisdiction here. The officers exchanged a look, and I could tell the younger one was trying to keep his confusion under control. The older officer sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Well, this is awkward, he muttered. Meanwhile, I could see the HOA board members lingering on the sidewalk, whispering frantically into their phones, probably calling for legal advice or trying to figure out how they had managed to escalate a mailbox dispute into something involving the local police. Their confidence had completely evaporated. I leaned against the doorframe, taking a casual sip of my coffee, enjoying the quiet chaos. It was almost cinematic: the perfectly manicured street, the confused cops, and two flustered HOA members realizing they had bitten off more than they could chew. "Look," I said to the officers, keeping my tone friendly, "I understand why they called you. They think they have authority here, they don't. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about ownership or property rights." The younger officer scribbled some notes, still clearly trying to process what I had just told him. The older one simply nodded. "You've got all your paperwork." "Of course," I said, patting my pocket where I kept copies of my deed and property documents. "I'm happy to show you any time." For a moment, the tension hung in the air like a thick fog. I could almost hear the HOA members' internal panic. They had imagined themselves in control, enforcing their rules, wielding imaginary power over every lawn and mailbox in the neighborhood. Now they were standing there, watching someone politely but firmly dismantle their authority, one calm sentence at a time. Then, in a slightly comedic twist, the younger officer looked at me and asked, "So technically, you own the whole block?" I smiled. "Technically, I literally own the entire block, every house, the streets, the sidewalks, even the community pool." The board members turned as pale as chalk. They were frozen in place, like deer caught in headlights, realizing in that exact moment that they had been trying to enforce rules on land that wasn't even theirs. I waved to the officers. "That's all you need to know. Have a good day." As they walked away, I watched the HOA members retreat to the edge of the sidewalk, whispering urgently to each other. I could practically hear their thoughts. "We messed up. We really messed up." And I knew deep down this wasn't over. Oh no, it was just getting started. Because at that moment, I realized I needed to dig a little deeper into the property records. If I truly owned the block, I had to understand the full scope of my ownership before the next confrontation. And I had a feeling the next time we met, it wasn't going to be a polite discussion. It was going to be a full-blown showdown. But for now, I took a deep breath, sipped my coffee, and smiled. Watching them squirm was oddly satisfying, and I knew the best was yet to come. After the police left, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for the HOA board to figure out their own mistakes. No, this was the moment to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I grabbed my laptop, brewed another strong cup of coffee, and settled into my home office. This wasn't just about a mailbox or a patch of grass anymore. I had a feeling the stakes were higher than anyone realized. I started pulling up public records, property deeds, and maps of the neighborhood. At first, it was tedious. Lots of scanned PDFs, legal jargon, and cross-references that made my head spin. But then, as I scrolled through one old map from the county office, I saw it. My eyes widened and I leaned back in my chair, trying not to laugh too loudly. The deed clearly stated that my property ownership included not just my house, but the entire block. Streets, sidewalks, even the small community park in the center, every inch of land the HOA thought they controlled was technically mine. I pinched myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. No, it was all there in black and white. Every property line, every road, every shared space, I was the legal owner. I couldn't resist chuckling. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit me. These HOA board members had been strutting around, lecturing neighbors, enforcing fines, and making rules on land that didn't even belong to them. They thought they were the kings and queens of the block, when in reality, they were just volunteers who had accidentally walked into someone else's kingdom. As I continued to dig, I found even more interesting details. The deed wasn't just a simple statement of ownership. It referenced easements, maintenance rights, and even responsibilities for community facilities. In other words, I had not only the right to live here as I pleased, but I also had the authority over the roads, the sidewalks, and the common spaces they were constantly policing. I leaned back and smiled, picturing their reactions when I would eventually reveal this. I imagined the woman in the blazer, flipping through her clipboard, realizing that every point she had argued at my door was completely irrelevant. I imagined the man with the tight smile, sputtering and whispering into his phone as he tried to figure out how he had miscalculated so badly. There was also a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing I had done nothing wrong. This wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding my rights and standing firm. And honestly, watching the board's overconfidence crumble from a safe distance was more fun than I expected. I made notes, organized the documents, and even created a simple visual diagram of the block showing all the areas technically under my ownership. It was surprisingly satisfying to see the whole picture laid out: my house, the neighboring houses, the tiny park, the pool, the streets. Every single inch was mine in a legal sense, even if the community had never realized it. By mid-afternoon, I knew what had to happen next. I couldn't just wait for the HOA to send another letter or knock on my door again. I needed to confront them in a way that would make them understand the reality of the situation without causing unnecessary chaos. This was the calm before the storm, the quiet moment where strategy mattered more than anger. Still, I couldn't help but laugh at the thought of the next encounter. Here were a few overzealous board members trying to control a neighborhood, completely unaware that I literally owned the streets they were packing on. They had no idea how wrong they were or how quickly reality would hit. As the sun began to dip behind the houses, casting long shadows across the lawns, I leaned back in my chair and sipped the last of my coffee. I had the documents, I had the facts, and most importantly, I had the upper hand. The only question left was when and how to reveal it. Because once the HOA board realized that I wasn't just a homeowner but the actual owner of the block, there would be no more rules or fines that could touch me. And I was determined to make that realization memorable for them. The stage was set, and I had a front row seat to watch the drama unfold. The next board meeting felt more like walking into enemy territory than a casual neighborhood gathering. I arrived a little early, as if I were stepping onto a stage where the spotlight was already on me, though no one knew it yet. The room was small, with beige walls, a long conference table, and the faint smell of coffee and overconfidence lingering in the air. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. I wasn't there to yell, threaten, or create chaos. I was there to show facts, the kind of facts that even the most confident HOA board member couldn't argue with. As I entered, the whispers began. Heads turned, eyes widened, and I could see the subtle panic flicker across their faces. I took a seat at the end of the table, casually placing my folder, my truth arsenal, in front of me. The board tried to start the meeting as usual, listing neighborhood issues and recent violations, but I could tell their energy had shifted. Their confident postures now betrayed uncertainty. Finally, the chairperson, a man who had previously towered over the neighborhood with his self-appointed authority, cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss recent compliance issues," he said, looking directly at me, though I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "Specifically regarding..." I raised a hand, interrupting gently but firmly. "Before we go any further, I'd like to clarify something important," I said, opening my folder and pulling out the property deeds. "I am the legal owner of the block, including the streets, sidewalks, common areas, and even the pool." A collective gasp echoed around the room. I could almost hear their brains scrambling. Did he just say what I think he said? I continued calmly, laying the deeds on the table, spreading them out so everyone could see the black and white truth. "This means the HOA rules, fines, and enforcement actions you've been attempting to impose on me are technically unenforceable," I said. "I'm happy to discuss neighborhood guidelines and cooperation, but legally I'm not under your authority." The chairperson froze mid-sentence, and I could see the panic in the other members' eyes. Some tried to smile, probably attempting to save face, while others whispered to each other, flipping through their own copies of the HOA bylaws like they might magically contradict the deeds I had just laid down. I sat back in my chair, letting the silence settle over the room. It was a quiet, tension-filled pause that stretched on long enough for them to realize their confidence had evaporated, leaving only uncertainty and disbelief. Then, trying to regain control, the chairperson stammered, "Well, that's an interesting interpretation." I smiled faintly. "It's not an interpretation, it's the legal record. I've double-checked it and everything is in order." A few members exchanged glances, whispering frantically. I could almost see the mental wheels turning. How did we miss this? How could we have enforced rules on land we didn't own? The irony of the situation was almost too good to be true. I had to suppress a chuckle. Still, I stayed composed. I knew that in moments like this, calm confidence was more powerful than anger or sarcasm. I was in control, and they were realizing it piece by piece. Every second they spent questioning themselves, every nervous glance exchanged was a tiny victory. I ended the first round of discussion with a simple statement. "I'm happy to cooperate with the neighborhood and maintain a peaceful community, but moving forward, I suggest we respect the boundaries of ownership." The room was quiet. No one spoke. Some board members fidgeted, others stared blankly at the table, and a few even avoided eye contact completely. I could feel the tension, the shift from control to confusion, like watching dominoes wobble before they fell. As the meeting adjourned, I gathered my folder, standing up calmly. "Thank you for your time," I said, nodding politely. "I look forward to moving forward with clarity." Outside, the air felt lighter. I walked back to my car, a quiet smile playing on my lips. The stage was set, and the board members had just realized they weren't in charge, not really, not over me. This was only the beginning of their awakening, and I knew the next steps would be even more dramatic. I had the legal power, the facts, and the patience to let reality slowly sink in, and soon the entire block would know exactly who really owned the neighborhood. After the board meeting, I knew I couldn't leave things half-explained. The HOA members had seen the deeds, yes, but I needed to make the full picture clear so there would be no confusion about authority, ownership, or boundaries. I spent the next few days organizing all my documents, drawing diagrams, and preparing a simple visual layout of the block, every street, every sidewalk, the tiny park, even the community pool. By the time I returned to the neighborhood, I was ready. I arranged a small gathering, not a meeting, more like a casual walkthrough with the board members on the very streets they had been policing as if they owned them. I carried a large folder with copies of all deeds and easements, and when I arrived, I saw the recognition on their faces. They had expected confrontation in the boardroom, but I had brought the evidence straight to the land itself. "Let's take a walk," I said calmly, spreading the documents on the hood of my car. The board members hesitated but followed. I pointed to the streets, the sidewalks, the little green space in the center of the block. "All of this," I explained, "is legally mine. Your HOA rules, fines, and enforcement powers do not apply to me or this property." I could see the shock spreading across their faces. Some tried to argue, but the words faltered as they glanced at the printed deeds I held up. Each time I made a point, street ownership, common areas, the pool, they grew paler, fumbling with their clipboards, whispering to each other like children caught misbehaving. One of the board members, the woman in the blazer who had first confronted me at my door, tried a half-hearted joke. "Well, I guess we should have checked the deeds first." I smiled. Exactly, that would have saved a lot of time and confusion. There was a strange mix of tension and humor in the air. They were clearly panicking on the inside, but they were trying to maintain some sense of dignity. I could practically hear the mental calculations happening in their heads. "We've been enforcing rules on land we don't even own. How did we miss this?" I stayed calm, almost enjoying the process. There was no need to be aggressive. The truth itself was powerful enough. Every document I showed, every line of the deed I pointed out reinforced reality. The board's authority ended where my ownership began. Then I took a small step further. I explained the easements and responsibilities. Because I own the streets and sidewalks, I'm responsible for their maintenance. I can set rules for usage if I choose. The HOA has no authority over these areas, and any attempts to enforce fines or rules here are legally unenforceable. Their mouths opened slightly, then closed. A few murmured, probably trying to process the fact that they had been overstepping their bounds for years. One board member looked as though he wanted to run away entirely. I couldn't resist a small jab of humor, not mean, just enough to underline the point. "All this time you've been enforcing rules on land that wasn't yours. Imagine the meetings, the complaints, the fines, completely unnecessary." By now, the tension had shifted. They weren't angry at me, they were angry at themselves, and I didn't need to add anything else. Reality had a way of sinking in faster than any argument could. Finally, I folded the deeds, nodded politely, and said, "I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. Moving forward, I hope we can have a peaceful neighborhood with cooperation instead of confrontation." They nodded meekly, their earlier confidence completely gone. I could feel the shift in the air. The power dynamics had changed, subtly but unmistakably. The HOA board members had realized the truth, slowly, painfully, and memorably. As I walked back to my house, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and amusement. The confrontation had been resolved not with shouting or threats, but with calm explanation and clear evidence. They had learned a valuable lesson, and I had shown that ownership and patience were more powerful than rules enforced by overconfidence. And yet I knew the story wasn't over. The board members still needed to process the reality fully. There were still meetings, whispers, and subtle attempts to regain authority, but I had set the stage. The next moves would be theirs, and I was ready to respond calmly, confidently, and with just a touch of humor. For now, I let the tension hang in the air, knowing that soon the entire block would understand exactly who really owned the neighborhood, and the HOA members would never forget it. It didn't take long before the HOA board tried to assert control again. I had anticipated it. After all, pride and overconfidence don't disappear overnight. This time they attempted to issue a fine for a violation on my property. They probably thought that by acting quickly, they could intimidate me back into submission. I couldn't wait to see how this would unfold. When the letter arrived, I calmly read it on my porch, sipping coffee as though it were a trivial morning memo. My smile widened. "Really?" I muttered. "This is their next move?" It felt almost cinematic, the perfect setup for a showdown that had been building for days. I decided to respond in person. There's something about confronting people face to face that magnifies reality in a way that emails or letters never can. I called the board members and invited them to meet at the property itself, specifying the street corner right next to the tiny community park. My tone was polite, neutral, but internally I was bracing for the moment when truth would hit hard. When they arrived, I could see the tension instantly. Their confident stride from previous meetings had vanished. Their faces were drawn, whispering to each other as though seeking reassurance that this time, somehow, they could enforce something. I leaned casually against my car, waiting for them to gather courage. "Good morning," I said, smiling warmly. "I received your letter. I understand you're trying to enforce a fine for a so-called violation." The chairperson stepped forward, trying to look authoritative, but I could see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Yes," he said slowly. "We believe there's a maintenance issue and it needs to be corrected." I calmly pulled out my deeds and easement documents, spreading them on the hood of my car like a courtroom exhibit. "Let's review this carefully. According to county records, I own the entire block, including the street, the sidewalks, the park, and the pool. Any enforcement actions or fines from the HOA for these areas are technically unenforceable." The silence was deafening. I could see them fumbling with their clipboards, whispering under their breath, trying to find some loophole, any argument that might give them authority. But there was none. Not a single line of their bylaws could override the deed that clearly outlined my ownership. I let the pause stretch long enough for the truth to sink in. You could almost see their brains spinning, desperately recalculating their sense of control. I felt a mix of amusement and satisfaction. It was almost like watching a slow-motion reaction in a movie. Then I added, calmly but with a touch of humor, "All this time, you've been enforcing rules on land you didn't even own. I'm sure that explains the confusion and panic at the last meeting." They didn't laugh, not even a nervous chuckle. Instead, they turned to each other, whispering furiously, likely realizing just how deep their mistake went. I could almost hear their internal thoughts. How did we not see this? How did we try to control someone legally above us? I maintained my composure, knowing that calm authority is always more powerful than anger or threats. "I don't want conflict," I said. "I simply want clarity. Moving forward, I suggest we operate within the limits of ownership and law. I'm happy to cooperate with neighbors, and I encourage a respectful community environment. But fines or enforcement attempts directed at me personally are unnecessary." A few board members opened their mouths, likely to argue, but the words faltered midair. Their earlier confidence had crumbled completely. I had taken the evidence, the location, and patience and turned it into undeniable authority. As the meeting, or more accurately, the confrontation ended, I packed up my documents. "Thank you for coming," I said warmly, hiding the satisfaction behind a polite smile. "I hope this clarifies everything." As they walked away, shoulders slumped and whispers still filling the air, I knew the truth had landed. They understood, perhaps reluctantly, that the rules they had wielded for years were meaningless here. The power dynamics had shifted. I wasn't just a homeowner. They realized I was the legal authority on the block. I watched them retreat down the street, realizing the showdown had ended without anger or chaos, only the quiet satisfaction of truth. I had asserted my rights with calm confidence and humor, and it had worked perfectly. The block was peaceful again for now, but the lessons were learned, and soon everyone in the neighborhood would understand exactly who really owned the neighborhood, and that would be a day to remember. After the showdown at the park, I knew the HOA board couldn't ignore the facts any longer, but seeing reality finally hit them, that was something else entirely. There's a special kind of satisfaction in watching people grasp the truth they've been stubbornly denying. And this time, it wasn't subtle. It started with phone calls. I could overhear snippets as they spoke nervously to each other or maybe to lawyers trying to figure out how to salvage their dignity. We didn't realize he owned the streets," one whispered, voice tight with panic. Another muttered, "Everything, the pool, the sidewalks, even the little park, it's all his property." I had intentionally stayed out of the conversation at first, letting the dominoes fall. They were scrambling to comprehend that all their meetings, all the rules they had been enforcing, were essentially meaningless in the areas I owned, and watching them wrestle with that realization was oddly satisfying. A few days later, the board scheduled an emergency meeting, clearly to strategize about how to deal with me, or maybe just to console each other after realizing they had been completely overstepping. I decided to attend, but this time I brought no folder, no documents. I didn't need them. The facts had already spoken, and the look on their faces when they saw me entering the room said it all. They tried their usual intimidation tactics, stern stares, clipped tones, and the occasional nervous clearing of throats, but it was obvious their confidence was gone. I could see them calculating, trying to figure out what leverage, if any, they could possibly have. There wasn't any. I spoke first, calmly, deliberately. I understand the confusion. It's a common mistake. People assume that because they form a board and enforce rules, they have authority. But as we've clarified, I am the owner of the block, including the streets, sidewalks, and common areas. A board member attempted to interject, voice shaky. Well, we thought we could. You thought, I interrupted gently, but you were mistaken. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of law, and the law is clear. You could see it in their eyes, the moment when pride collides with reality. I let the silence linger long enough for it to settle fully. They weren't angry at me, they were coming to terms with their own miscalculations. It was like watching someone realize mid-step that the ground they thought they stood on had been replaced with quicksand. Some members tried to argue small points, like maintenance responsibilities or community guidelines, but even these were just minor details compared to the full picture. I nodded patiently, acknowledging their points, then reminded them of the broader truth. The authority they had wielded was limited. The ownership rested with me. Finally, the chairperson leaned back, defeated but composed. "We understand," he said quietly, voice lacking its usual assertiveness. "It seems we overstepped." I smiled. It happens. But moving forward, I suggest we cooperate respectfully. We can maintain a friendly community without overstepping boundaries or issuing unnecessary fines. The tension lifted slightly, replaced by a subdued acknowledgement. They had realized fully, completely, that the rules they had been enforcing did not apply to me. It wasn't just about the street or the mailbox anymore. It was about understanding limits and respecting reality. As the meeting adjourned, I stood at the door, glancing back at their faces. Some were relieved, others still shocked, but all were processing the truth. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. The satisfaction came from the acknowledgement itself. They had been confronted by facts, calmly and clearly presented, and there was no denying it. Walking back to my car, I felt a sense of closure mixed with amusement. The HOA members would never forget this lesson. They had learned, perhaps painfully, that confidence without knowledge can backfire spectacularly, and for the first time, the neighborhood had clarity. The block was mine, legally and definitively, and the HOA board had no choice but to accept it. The storm had passed, and what remained was an almost cinematic calm, the kind that comes after tension, after confrontation, after truth has been revealed. As I got into my car, I realized the most important lesson wasn't about ownership or authority. It was about patience, preparation, and letting reality do the talking. They had learned their lesson, and I had proven that sometimes, quiet confidence and clarity are far more powerful than confrontation or anger. And in that moment, standing in the sunlight on a block I owned completely, I knew the final act. The resolution was just around the corner. Peace, at last, would be restored. After the HOA board finally accepted reality, a strange calm settled over the block. It wasn't instant, there was still a lingering tension in the air, but the dynamic had shifted completely. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt normal, peaceful even. I took a morning stroll down the streets I legally owned, smiling at neighbors who were still cautiously adjusting to the new reality. Some waved politely, others gave a thumbs up, and a few whispered behind hands, likely recounting the HOA saga to anyone who would listen. I didn't mind. It was funny, really, seeing the ripple effect of one carefully handled confrontation. The HOA board, once so confident and overbearing, had become almost comically subdued. Their meetings were shorter, their tone calmer, and most importantly, they didn't attempt to enforce any rules on me personally. They had learned their limits, and the lesson had been memorable. I couldn't help but grin when I imagined the conversations behind closed doors, boards questioning everything they had done, checking deeds, trying to reconcile pride with reality. I decided to establish a small set of fair, common-sense neighborhood guidelines, not because I needed to, but because a peaceful community works better when people cooperate. Nothing fancy, nothing heavy-handed. Just respect for property, a few safety reminders, and most importantly, mutual acknowledgement of boundaries. It was simple, effective, and completely enforceable without drama. One day, while walking past the community pool, I saw the chairperson from the HOA quietly adjusting a lounge chair, probably making sure everything complied with the rules he no longer controlled. He looked up, saw me, and gave a small, sheepish nod. I nodded back. No words were necessary. The point had been made. Authority wasn't about bluster, it was about law, facts, and occasionally a little patience. The other board members began to approach me over the following weeks, not with confrontation but with cooperation. They asked questions about shared spaces, offered suggestions for minor improvements, and even admitted that they had been a little overzealous before. I listened, smiled, and answered politely, knowing full well that the power dynamics had shifted. They were learning to respect the reality of ownership. Neighbors also began to notice the difference. With the board no longer overstepping, the streets felt freer, quieter, and more welcoming. Kids could play in the park without someone scrutinizing every detail, homeowners could maintain their properties without unnecessary fines, and everyone slowly realized that life was better when rules were reasonable and authority was recognized properly. I couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all: the overconfident board, the fines, the meetings, the police visits, and the countless tiny rules they had tried to impose. It all seemed surreal now, almost like a comedy played out over weeks of tension and suspense. I laughed quietly to myself, knowing that the most powerful tool I had used wasn't anger, aggression, or confrontation. It was patience, clarity, and the simple fact of ownership. Occasionally, the board would meet quietly behind closed doors. I could imagine them still whispering, still recalculating, still learning the lesson that overconfidence without knowledge can lead to ridiculous situations. And I didn't mind. Sometimes, it's entertaining to watch people adjust to reality when it hits them unexpectedly. Now the block feels like it should, calm, orderly, but without unnecessary interference. The HOA members have found their proper place, not as rulers but as neighbors who contribute respectfully to the community. And for me, life is simple. I walk my streets, maintain my property, and enjoy the satisfaction of knowing the truth has settled firmly in place. Looking back, I realize the story isn't just about ownership or HOA rules. It's about understanding your rights, standing firm when necessary, and approaching conflict with patience, clarity, and yes, a little humor. Sometimes that's all it takes to turn a potentially tense, dramatic situation into a peaceful, lasting resolution. As the sun sets over the block I legally own, I take a deep breath and smile. The lawns are green, the streets are quiet, the community pool glimmers in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, everything feels exactly as it should: life on my terms and a neighborhood that finally understands boundaries. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.